who express them. They do not necessarily represent the opinions of Revolution Radio and freedomslips.com, its staff, or affiliates. You're listening to Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com, 100% listener-supported radio, and now we return you to your host.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another edition of Cosmic Catastrophe on Revolution Radio, 100% listener supported, and we ask you to donate if you can over at revolution.radio. My lovely co-host Leah and I will not be hosting the show next Saturday. Ransom Godwin from 420 The Freedomist Films will be filling in because Leah and I will be at the San Luis Valley Sea Exchange. So welcome to the show.
Hello.
We are going to be continuing our conversation with Expanding Earth, giving you some more details. But before we do that, I want to talk about why Expanding Earth isn't a more discussed topic in geology or earth sciences in general. Now, there are a couple of things that I want to throw out here. There is a large group of topics that are considered pseudoscience, or conspiracy theories, and they're easily debunked. Things like Nibiru, two suns, stellar cores, or giant spaceships in the inner solar system. The reason these things can be easily disproven is because there are tens of thousands of scientists looking at the observational data and they don't see anything to support it. So those are the pseudo-scientific ideas or the conspiracy theories that can be easily debunked. There are, however, a lot of scientific theories that have a lot of evidence, like the fact that there was an ancient civilization before the Younger Dryas that got obliterated that nobody wants to talk about. And why? There is overwhelming evidence of advanced technology in Egypt, of advanced cutting, of advanced engineering and moving of blocks. This also is in the Mayan regions in South America, in the Far East, in India, everywhere across the globe. There are these megalithic blocks. Easter Island, we showed you a megalithic wall. And they're unexplainable. And they're explained away as being recently made by cultures that couldn't have possibly made them. Mm-hmm. So Leah, what do you think is going on with all this?
I mean, the typical procedure, right, is to take the facts that are inconvenient to what you believe and to ignore them, or to explain them away, or try to explain them in the way like you just suggested. But I mean, this is being done in a manner that is frankly insulting, right? To suggest, for example, that those megalithic walls were built by people more recently who didn't have the tools or the skills to do that. I mean, that's just an insulting idea. It's very dismissive. And this is something that happens all the time in science, right? If you present ideas for a new theory that challenges the old theory, well, all of the scientists who have built their entire careers on the old theory will be very defensive about defending the old theory because their entire lives had been invested in that. And on some level, I can sort of understand that, but it really hampers the progress of science, and it's a shame.
Yeah, and this is a stunning example. So, and I can attest to this. In the field of geology, the plate tectonics, the geophysical scientists that are working on these types of ideas are all using the old theory and all the old understandings of the hypothesis, where there's mid-ocean ridges, right? We have divergent plate boundaries, we have subduction zones, and they're all assuming that all of that is equal and that the Earth is constant.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
right.
And there are other groups that are more fringe scientists that also believe in the same Earth-size concept, including the Thunderbolts Project.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so we're going to get to that in the second half of the show, some of the mechanisms and some of the things we believe could be going on, and why expansion Earth is probably a more correct science than plate tectonics. We're not saying that there isn't subduction. Lee and I aren't saying that there isn't mid-ocean ridges. All of these things are happening. It's just that the dynamics of what's going on suggests, and then we're going to get into this in the first half, just the general concept of the formation of Earth screams expanding Earth, because the way they talk about it is that the Earth was molten, then it cooled. Well, when it cooled, it would have formed a crust. And there's a big difference between the crust and the ocean crust, continental and ocean, a substantial difference, almost 3 times as thick. So the supposition would be that after the Earth cooled, a crust formed. And then for some reason, it expanded a little, cracks formed. Then we'd get this thin crust called ocean crust. Because as it cracked and opened, maybe some water flowed in there and cooled that magma quickly, keeping it thin. I mean, Occam's razor. This is critical thinking, what they tell us is happening, and then how else would you get these cracks in this thin crust?
Well, and you said it earlier, like one of the critical pieces to all of this, and always when examining a new theory, is to look at the premises that are being used in the old theory. Like you said it earlier, the plate tectonics assumes that Earth has always been the same size, but that is really nothing but an assumption. And that premise may be faulty.
It may be. But if the Earth is expanding, as we may believe, you and I mean, we're leaning towards that. The question then becomes, is the Earth getting hollow?
Right.
Now, I did a shallow dive into the hollow Earth idea. And within an hour or two, it will be revealed to you that hollow Earth is nothing more than a fairy tale. A bunch of people made up a bunch of different stories, and there's no evidence to support any of them. And so this goes to the pseudoscience and the conspiracy theory, and then the getting muddled with actual science that's being ignored here, the expanding Earth. Now, I'm going to read you this essay. It's very good. And it exposes what hollow Earth is. It begins by saying one can never be sure just how serious they are about it. But there does exist a group of people who call themselves the Flat Earth Society. Right? There's also a group of people, even people that watched the Apollo moon launch, that today still believe that the moon landing was fake. And this is because of staged films by Kubrick that they were using because they didn't think that maybe they could even get video footage on the moon. Like, they had no idea what they were getting into. So they wanted to make sure they had a product for the public. Let's say they launched these guys to the moon and they all died or melted. I don't think they were going to tell the public that. They were going to fake it.
Well, maybe they would have. I mean, we did that with Challenger, right? When we had a horrible catastrophe with Challenger, and we didn't hide that from the public. Although going to the moon,
was live streamed, right?
Yeah.
I watched it in school. I don't know what grade I was in.
I know I was in
third grade. Yay! And then it blew up, and then the teachers were like turning the TV off. Everyone sit down.
I know. We had like a whole assembly in our auditorium. I remember they like sat us outside of the auditorium later, I guess, to like process it or something. I don't know.
Okay. So we've got these actual groups of tens of thousands of people that believe these insane ideas. I don't know why, because, and Ransom is trying to set this up for us. He's going to be hosting the show next Saturday. What we're going to do is we're going to get live streamers from different latitudes. We're going to get somebody up in northern Canada. We're going to get somebody up in North Dakota. We'll get me here in southern Colorado, Ransom all the way down there by Mexico. And we're all going to live stream going outside with a 6-foot stick. We're going to stick it into the ground and we're going to measure the shadow live. And Ransom's going to have the smallest shadow. The biggest shadow is going to be up in Canada. And we're going to do the same experiment that was done thousands of years ago in Egypt, in Heliopolis. And we're going to prove live on air.
But the Earth is a sphere. What?
Well, we're not going to prove it's a sphere. We'll prove by definitively it's curved.
Yeah.
I
mean, it's funny how easy it is to disprove that.
It is. And how many people don't take the time.
Yeah.
Okay, so modern day proponents of the hollow earth theory can refer non-believers to the book, The Hollow Earth. This book came out in 1979, was authored by Raymond Bernard. Now, Bernard, judging from the initials he lists on the book behind his name, holds every advanced academic degree possible in the entire world. So this may leave you pause because, again, on a book, you can put anything you want, right? It could be your pen name. So he could just be pretending, because there's very few people that are, everything.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the publisher said he's a bit of a recluse. And in the book, take a listen to this. As a spokesman for the publisher states in the foreword of the book, I will not enter in any correspondence regarding this book or the author. Whether you accept or reject the content of this book is your privilege. No one cares. That's in the book.
Like that, I just refuse to have any dialogue about this theory? Is that what he's saying?
The author or the publisher.
Okay, that's a problem in and of itself. Like,
And
if
the
you have
publisher
a theory
says-
that you think is viable, you should be willing to have that conversation. I'm sorry, but being a recluse is not an excuse.
A recluse, whether you accept or reject the content of this book is your privilege. No one cares.
That's a big red flag to me.
Okay, yeah. Let's share the screen and make it even more ridiculous, shall we?
Okay.
So the crux of the hollow earth theory is that the earth is a shell that's only about 800 miles thick. And in the polar regions, there are holes that are 1,400 miles across with edges that curve smoothly from the outside to the inside of the shell over that 800-mile diameter. So you can literally just keep walking and you would never know the difference between the outer and the inner earth. Does that even seem plausible?
That doesn't make any, I mean, how would you not know the difference, right? The shadows are going to change dramatically once you go inside that hole.
Right, and it'll probably be dark. I've gone in a cave. Now, Bernard goes on to explain in the book that the holes have never been seen from the air because pilots are fooled by their navigational systems. And they actually believe they're crossing the pole when they are actually following this unique hole's magnetic rim.
What? Like, how would they not see it?
Yeah. Thus, it's 1,400 miles wide, according to the book.
How would you not see that?
Well, according to Bernard, aircraft never really fly over the geographic poles because of this magnetic anomaly. They're actually following the hole's magnetic rim. As irrefutable proof in the book, he cites Admiral Byrd's statement on his expedition that Admiral Byrd states, and I quote, "I'd like to see that land beyond the pole. That area beyond the pole is the great unknown." Well, that statement doesn't talk about a hole or a hollow earth or anything.
I'll be honest, I would believe more the concept of, like, at the pole that there's another dimension that you can portal into. That would make more sense to me.
Well, we're getting to that.
Oh, well.
Because according to some people, this is where the aliens live and UFOs fly out of the hole. Now, the hollow earth theory actually seems to have originated in the early 1800s by John Sims. He is an earnest American who devoted the greater part of his life to convincing the world that the earth was formed by a series of concentric shells, like nesting tables or dolls. He believed that there were miles of wondrous, unclaimed domain beneath our feet with lush vegetation, fish and game for the taking. And there were those that took him seriously. And so there's all these iterations of hollow earth. I'm going to show you all the old maps. There's there's actually a map of the inside here with islands. I don't know how you just float them in the center there. It's very bizarre. There's a picture here of another planet of it being reversed, where the solar system is inside and you're living on the inner shell instead of the outer shell.
Okay.
What do you think of that idea?
Well, I mean, I don't, a lot of the suppositions of these theories, I don't even know why you would presume this in the first place. Like, okay, if you want to argue hollow earth, okay, but why argue that there's holes at the North and South Pole? Like, why, when there's no evidence of that. There's no evidence of that. And then the solar system, I mean, we see it outside of Earth. So why would you argue that it's inside Earth?
Yeah. Yeah, I don't
even understand the point.
Yeah.
And I'm being extremely dismissive, right? Which I just a little while ago, I kind of criticized generally, but I'm being really dismissive because there's no evidence being presented. There's nothing being presented that convinces me of anything.
Right. And then you think about it critically and you look at these maps. How did they come up with this map? No one has been in the inner Earth.
Right.
This is just a fairy tale.
It's just imagination.
It's imagination. Beautiful. And that is the difference between pseudoscience, conspiracy theory, and actual science that's being suppressed, like expanding Earth.
Mm-hmm. Which is funny because expanding Earth is often accused of being a pseudoscience.
Yep. And I'm going to prove to you that there are objects in the solar system before the end of this podcast that are expanding.
Mm-hmm.
And that will blow your mind. And then anyone that's on the fence, when they see this evidence, it's coming from Europa, a moon that we now know a lot about. It is a water world, very similar to Earth in the sense that it has all of the building blocks for life. Mm-hmm. But that's all. That's the little tidbit we're going to leave here. But before we move into some of the expanding Earth stuff that I'd like to talk about with you, I want to confirm something that you and I have been discussing now for weeks. So as Leah and I have done this deep dive into cosmic catastrophe scenarios, we've come to the conclusion that objects hitting Earth are probably happening a lot more often than is being revealed.
Mm-hmm.
And guess what just happened the other day?
We got hit by an object.
No, a paper was released claiming that extinction level asteroids could be far more common than we thought. Yeah, and what they did was, well, I'll read you the title: Reassessing the Past Million Years of Neo-Impact Cratering on Earth Using High-Resolution Digital Topography. So it's similar to finding all those hidden Carolina bays with using that LiDAR. They're doing the same thing here, and they were scared to death when they looked at it in a different way. They saw that, well, the Earth is being hit by big things a lot. And this is just the last million years. Yeah, so take a look down here at the graph of just some of the size objects that have hit within the last million years. There are 4 objects between 26 kilometers and 35 kilometers hitting Earth. And that will be big. Yeah, that's a bad day.
Yeah.
So this is real science. You and I, we were doing a deep dive on all these different papers, and we're sitting there and we're like, oh my gosh, it's like the Earth is getting slammed by objects and no one's talking about it. And then this paper comes out.
Right. Does this paper make a distinction between clearly like impact craters and things that may be caused by, like, let's say, a plasma discharge?
No,
probably not.
No, we're not. We're definitely not that far into the future here.
Yeah. Because electric universe theory is just a pseudoscience too, right?
Right. But these have craters of at least 10-kilometer diameter.
Jeez.
And larger. Yeah, so
well, I'll throw out there too, in one respect, just acknowledging that there are this many impacts is really important. And in a way, it doesn't matter if it's an object or plasma discharge, right? It just shows that Earth is being affected by forces outside of itself a lot more often than we think.
Yeah, and that anyone that believes that this empire that we're living in somehow is going to keep moving forward, I mean, that's the sad reality, that this is going to end at some point. Whether or not, it's not necessarily today, but it's not going to stick around for very long. And we simply came to this conclusion looking at all the evidence, all the physical evidence, all of the proxy data, all of the scientific literature. We came to this conclusion before they wrote the paper.
Yeah.
And the paper, well, shows us that an object 30 kilometers wide just hit a few thousand years ago.
Wow. Wow.
So no wonder it's so hard to recover.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and history shows that civilizations rise and fall again and again and again and again. And there's clearly a lot of variables in that, but surely this is one of them, because an object hitting Earth is extremely disruptive, especially if it's that large.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a game changer. It would make the skies dark and et cetera, et cetera. And probably a tiny little impactor that we're talking about, right?
Mm-hmm.
The Bay of Carpentaria.
Gulf of Carpentaria.
The Gulf of Carpentaria.
Now we're trying to say it correctly.
I think that's correct.
We were
Please confirm
corrected.
in the comments if Carpentaria is correct. So these two objects that hit the Gulf of Carpentaria left small craters. How big were those?
Oh, I think one is like 7 miles wide, and the other one's like 11 and a half.
Yeah, so they're
like
half
that.
the size of these giant objects that we were talking about.
Yeah.
Which means that if 4 30-kilometer wide objects came into the atmosphere in a million years, hundreds of thousands of smaller objects came into the atmosphere in that same time.
Mm-hmm.
Objects are hitting all the time. And this is confirmed because we can see these bolides coming in almost weekly or daily, especially when we're in meteor storms that are known. A lot of times, some of those meteors hit the ground and we go and find them. One just hit Texas, one just hit Canada, one just hit the UK. They just found one of the top 10, I think, largest meteorites in Antarctica. It was 17 pounds and about the size of a softball. Yeah, just sitting there on the ice.
Interesting.
Now, the problem with those is those objects could have come in millions of years ago.
Sure. Well, but if it's sitting on top of the ice, probably not.
Yeah, well, ice melts on the fringes. And
Sure.
So what they did in the Antarctic study, someone created a map where the ice is exposed, older ice is exposed. And that would be where you would look for the meteors. Because if millions of years of ice is melted or sublimated due to evaporation, a million years worth of sediment that was in that ice will all be laying on the surface.
Yeah.
Yes. And so these meteorites are just sitting there.
Yeah.
So a very interesting place to visit, but it's very cold. So the hollow earth, inner earth, Agartha, whatever you want to call it, is a fairy tale. Well, actually, not so much a fairy tale. There are large cave systems on Earth. You know, some of them are Mammoth Caves on the east coast of the United States, has over 400 miles of caverns mapped. And there are some giant caverns in the Far East that are miles deep and contain their own biosphere. You've heard of these.
Yeah, that's fascinating.
People base jump into them. And so what we do know is that there's large caverns in the earth, definitely not a hollow earth. More scientific evidence on how there can't be a hollow earth is we've gone down deep in drill holes. There's the Russian hellhole that went down miles, and they heard like screaming in this hole. Have you ever seen those?
No,
videos?
I've never heard of that. No.
They actually stopped drilling because it was creeping them out. But what happens when you get deeper is the temperature begins to rise. There's a cavern that they found, I think it's in Mexico or somewhere in South America, with these giant gypsum crystals that are like 300 foot long. Have you ever seen that footage?
No.
You have to wear a respirator because it's so deep in the ground and there's very little oxygen, but it's like 190 degrees in there.
Yeah.
Because it's so deep.
Yeah.
So once you get like deeper than the crust, if you were in the hollow earth, it'd be thousands of degrees. So there's a problem.
Yeah.
So based on everything we said, the probability of hollow earth is 0. What do you think?
I basically agree. I mean, there are moments where, like when we talk about expanding Earth, where it's sort of tempting to consider the idea of a hollow Earth simply because it would solve certain problems around density and gravity. But I just don't see any reason to lean in that direction with all of the evidence that we have of, like you said, temperature and magma and all of that. I just don't see, I don't see how it's possible.
And another problem happens. If you're a scuba diver out there, you know what I'm about to say. When you go underwater, I think it's every 30 feet. There's another atmosphere of pressure that gets put on your body.
Yeah.
And so at some point you get crushed to death.
Yeah.
In air, it's a lot more distance. I think it's 1,000 feet is equivalent to 30 feet in water.
Mm-hmm.
But still, if you go down 10 miles, your body will be crushed to death because of the atmospheric pressure.
Yeah.
Oh, what a good segue into more evidence on the expanding Earth when we come back.
Listen to Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com, and we'll be right back after this message.
Who owns you? If you're not in control, then someone else is. Join me, Ivy West, for Voices on the Wind, Saturday. I discuss government, health, metaphysics, suppressed science, universal mysteries, little-known incredible facts, alternative energies, and even more than you can imagine.
There was blood on the wire.
Won't you join us on Revolution Radio Saturdays for Voices on the Wind with me, Ivy West.
There are lives in the balance. People under fire. Children at the cannons.
Because if your head's in the sand, your tail is a target.
Thank you for listening to Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com, the #1 listener-supported radio station on the internet. Please help support this station so this battle can continue forward. Revolution Radio!
There have been imaginative science fiction writers for generations.
Be evasive.
But that doesn't mean that they're telling the truth as opposed to fiction.
I'm aware of some archaeologists that have uncovered large bones indicating giants in Virginia. Genesis chapter 6, verse 4, there were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God came unto the daughters of men, indicating that there were giants before the Nephilim.
And sons of God, plural. They weren't talking about Jesus coming down and
No, that's right. Yeah. Uh-huh.
I'm Steve Crawford. Join me every Thursday night in Studio A at 6 p.m. Eastern for Factor Theory Live. Find us on www.revolution.radio. Great guests and great stories. What do you believe?
Join me on the Brian Rouge Show on Revolution Radio, Eastern Standard Time, every Tuesday night from 6 to 8. We talk about the four most vital things, in my view, affecting all of humanity. Number one is UFOs and aliens and their agenda for the advancement of humanity. Number two is the Jewish establishment's control over all aspects of human civilization. Number three, the truth about Adolf Hitler, how he was the opposite of what we've been told. Number four is advanced ancient global civilizations. Join me on the Brian Rouge Show, Tuesday nights from 6 to 8 on Studio B on Revolution Radio.
Thank you for listening to Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com. Any commercial advertising you may hear in this program is of the sole discretion and benefit of the host of whose program you are listening to. Revolution Radio does not endorse any commercial products, nor does it accept monetary compensation for on-air advertising of commercial products, nor will it ever. We are and shall remain 100% listener supported. Any product advertising on this program are considered used at buyer risk, and Revolution Radio shall not be held liable for any claims or damages received from any product advertised within this program. Revolution Radio, where information never sleeps. The opinions expressed on this radio station, its programs, and its website by the hosts, guests, and call-in listeners or chatters are solely the opinions of the original source who expressed them. They do not necessarily represent the opinions of Revolution Radio and FreedomSlips.com, its staff, or affiliates. You're listening to Revolution Radio, FreedomSlips.com, 100% listener-supported radio, and now we return you to your host.
And we're back with the second half of Cosmic Catastrophe on Revolution Radio, the #1 listener-supported radio. So go support them over on Patreon.
Nice.
And
also,
we stopped this. Go ahead.
Sorry, a reminder that you can see a video replay of this show this evening, usually around 7:30 Mountain Time. So that's 5:30 Eastern on Magnetic Reversal News on YouTube. And of course, it's there for longevity as well. That's just the premiere.
Yeah, so go get it. Mm-hmm. Now, what we were talking about, debunking Hollow Earth. So if you still believe in that, that's fine.
I wanted to point one thing out about your debunking, which is at the end you were talking about the immense pressure that would be inside Earth. Now, obviously, that would just if Hollow Earth was a thing, that would simply make it impossible for us to go inside. It doesn't necessarily disprove Hollow Earth in and of itself, right? But
most biological life that we know living on the surface is at atmospheric pressure. So none of the surface people are going to be able to walk in there.
Right. The part where there's this idea that there's an inner world with organic life and all of that kind of stuff, that part certainly is out the window.
Well, it gets crazy. I was just look at this. At the break, I'm taking a look at the map here.
Yeah.
It's who named these places?
I know.
At Vadabar's here in Milois, and here is the Blasphemespinal or the Platuja. And right in the middle,
with a whole new language.
Take a look in the middle here. Schwang. Right? That's the capital of Inner Earth. Schwang. It's crazy. Here's the
I really like this one where at the bottom it says the cry of the Wahila.
Yeah,
like,
I hate that. Wahilas are scary. The Great Dying is over here, and then we have the Headless Valley. It looks like a great place to be. Bury your memory right here. Here's the funeral heart. Cold dead leaves. This looks like hell. I want nothing to do with the Inner Earth.
We're not going.
Yeah, let's talk about expanding Earth and why it's a no-brainer.
Mm.
Now, you sent me over this little paper from xearththeory.com with some ideas about expanding Earth, some of the debunkers.
Mm-hmm.
And we talked about a few of these.
Yeah, and some of these potential mechanisms have, I think, good ideas with issues that could be modified.
Yes. And I like the one that you and I were talking about last night. So let's talk about that.
Mm-hmm.
Let me bring up a picture. This is a mock-up of what a cross-section of the Earth looks like. It doesn't really look like this, but it's for the most part delineated in these different layers. Some of the outer core sticks up high into the mantle, and these are the super low velocity shear zones.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's not this concentric. And a lot of people think that this outer core is leaking up towards the surface and forming the hot spots and some of the volcanic arcs we see, like the Hawaiian Islands, the East African Rift Zone, etc.
Mm-hmm.
But the idea is that you and I were talking about is in the very early stages of Earth's formation, whatever that may be. According to the mainstream science, the Earth is billions of years old, 5.8 billion. Let's just make up a number because they do. And and for billions of years, it was a hot molten ball cooling down.
Mm-hmm.
If that was the case, then a crust would form on the molten ball eventually everywhere, which would be this yellow line. Which would mean that when the Earth first cooled, it had a crust on the entire surface. the crust would have probably been similar in thickness.
Mm-hmm.
And what we see today on Earth is two types of crust, ocean crust and continental crust, which are very different thicknesses. So how do we get to that place?
Right.
The easiest idea is to crack the continental crust, which is the first crust formed, through a series of convections or something happening in the asthenosphere in the lower mantle to bring up magma. And this magma cools more rapidly, forming the thinner crust, which we now call ocean crust.
Mm-hmm.
And it's pretty interesting because the idea is that the early Earth may have been super rotating. It could have been anything. We don't know. But the supposition is that this inner and outer core is a new phenomenon, that the original core of Earth was some super dense material that as the Earth cooled and formed that crust began to expand.
Yeah.
And I can totally see this.
Can I jump in on this?
Yeah.
I mean, so there's a site called alternativephysics.org that is run by a guy named Bernard Burchell. And he suggests an interesting expansion mechanism where this picture here is useful. So the idea, right, is that right now, we believe that the core is an iron and nickel, right?
Yeah.
And then the lower mantle is mostly silicates. Now, the core density is compressed, so it's far more dense than those iron nickel compounds would be on the surface because there's tons of pressure, right? And there's also there would also be essentially more gravity in the core than on the surface. And then it's sort of the same thing with the mantle. The silicates they're compressed more than they would be on the surface. But what he suggests is that perhaps at one time that these two groups of compounds were actually much more mixed. And over time, that the iron nickel, because it's denser than the silicates, would settle into the interior, into the core. So they would be basically dropping because of the lower density. And then when that happens, you've got less density in the lower mantle, which actually creates a situation where the lower mantle is putting less pressure on the core, and then that allows the core to expand.
Right. So in this case, if you're a mineralogist, you might know what I'm getting at here is that the lattices change based on pressure. So what we know is that a molecule is generally mostly space. Almost all these solid objects around us are all space. They're held together by bonds, electromagnetic bonding of different kinds. Yes. We've got ionic bonds, we've got covalent bonds, we've got van der Waals bonds. Each are different.
And then you have the electromagnetics between, neutrons and protons and electrons and all of that. So that's where all the space is, right? Because you've got forces acting against each other.
Right. And if so you have space, then you have the ability to crush that space.
Yes.
And when you crush the space, you don't necessarily change the thing. You just change the structure of the thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So this is completely plausible. I can see it happening all at once. So in the early days when we had tiny Earth, something, was keeping that core mixed. And then when the shell formed, the core starts to separate. Those heavier things are getting pushed into the inner core, to that solid, whatever it is.
Mm-hmm.
And the lower mantle is literally expanding like a sponge when you put water in it.
Right.
It's still the same amount of stuff. It's just less dense, and that cracks the crust and starts forming this ocean crust.
One of the things that is very helpful about this concept is that it does potentially explain, like we've talked about how it appears that if there is expansion of the Earth, that didn't begin until, like, let's say 200 million years ago. And that's because we only see oceanic crust that I've seen some people say that there's no oceanic crust that's older than 180 million years old, but I've also seen some people say 300 million years old. So
there's a small piece of 340 million year old ocean. There's a small triangle.
Yeah.
But as you slowly move away from it, it rapidly changes towards, like, say 200. So it appears as if there was an early expansion, maybe
Right.
And that's why we get the multiple iterations of supercontinents.
Right. Right.
So
Well,
maybe
so-
Earth started expanding, that mechanism failed, it shrunk a little, and then again it started again.
It could be, yeah. So
Like it was a
let's
cycle.
let's just say that the expansion started at 350 million years
Yeah.
ago.
Yeah.
And
So then
it's
you
like,
know why
okay,
I think that's right? Because at 419 million is the explosion of fishes. So from 419 to 350 during the Devonian is the age of fishes. And so these fishes all of a sudden showed up all over the earth. Why?
Right.
Because there was oceans.
Yeah. Yeah, clearly something's changing. But it solves the question of like, okay, why did the expansion not potentially start until 350 million years ago? And it may have something to do with this concept of the denser, heavier elements sinking towards the center. However, there is also a problem here, which is that so now we have this sphere that it basically has constant mass all throughout, regardless of the expansion. And so it does not address the issue of the force of gravity in the time of dinosaurs. In fact, it creates a situation where you've got a smaller Earth where the surface is closer to the core, so the strength of gravity is going to be even stronger on the surface.
Exactly.
So that's kind of an issue.
But maybe gravity is something that we really don't understand.
Well, there's that very good possibility. So,
and because also, if you have a smaller Earth and we've got all this water around, people often question, like, wouldn't the oceans be 10,000 foot deep across the whole Earth when it was tiny?
Mm-hmm.
And the answer is no. All of the moisture would be in a super thick atmosphere.
Yeah, which is
and so maybe that has something to do with how the dinosaurs were able to live.
Yeah.
The atmosphere could have been 3 times as thick.
Right.
And I don't know what that does to or doesn't do to gravity.
Well, and that also, it would necessitate some changes in how we think about the biology of dinosaurs. Because I imagine that breathing an atmosphere that is super thick in water may be a slightly different beast than the atmosphere we breathe right now. It might do something different to our lungs.
Yeah, well, and it's with a thick atmosphere like that, it makes sense that 60-foot animals called pterodons could fly around.
Yeah.
This is like a horse with wings, for goodness sakes.
Yeah, yeah.
And they're flying all over the skies.
Right, right.
So there's got to be something completely different going on. And so this mechanism we just talked about, the density change, is a physical mechanism that requires no pseudoscience, no aliens, that can actually just happen based on some chemical changes within the Earth.
Yeah. And not even necessarily chemical, right? It's literally just like a physical separation that's occurred. That's the idea.
Anyway. You know, something's triggering this. Maybe it's like the cooling. It reaches a critical temperature after 3 billion years of cooling. And then this thing starts happening. And then the iron starts raining down. And then the Earth goes, oh my God, and gets less dense.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. It's kind of weird. But what I find stranger is that dinosaurs live for, 40, about 200 million years on Earth, and then they just go away.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm really intrigued by this concept of the thicker atmosphere and that like making it possible to fly. I'm just going to throw this in there. It's just kind of silly, but you know how a lot of people have flying dreams? Well, when I was a child, instead of having flying dreams, I would have these dreams where I was kind of like floating above a certain surface, like as if I was actually floating in water. Maybe I'm having some sort of genetic memory about what Earth used to be like.
Yeah, I have those same dreams. And all I had to do is flap my arms. I didn't have wings, and I could push up a little higher.
Yeah. And it was like a feeling.
I was always trying to avoid power lines in my dream.
But it was like a feeling of like floating or of being suspended and trying to maintain that buoyancy.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly how I experienced it. Wow.
Interesting. Okay, so that's really interesting. Because I do really strongly believe in genetic memory and past lives. So maybe we're remembering something.
Well, yeah, you've heard it before. We're suffering from amnesia.
Yeah.
And that goes all the way back to Velikovsky, but some famous people who write books actually stole that and now get quoted as coining that term.
Right, right. Well, maybe we were once dinosaurs. Maybe that was one of our incarnations.
Right, and that would explain the lizard people and the whole conspiracy.
Yeah.
So. All right, before we go forward, one of the cutting edge alternative scientists in expanding Earth was Neal Adams, and he began doing work decades ago. Unfortunately, he died.
Yeah.
So his work came abruptly to an end. And he was a huge proponent of the expanding Earth idea, so much so that he started looking at Europa. And if you're looking at this video, which you can't see because you're on the radio, what they simply did is looked at the surface of Europa. They had no idea back then when Neal made this that Europa was ice and had an ocean underneath and may even be volcanic and any of these things that we know today. But he simply used simple geologic techniques and the law of superposition, which came first, and reverse engineered the surface of Europa. And all they did is, you can see it here. This, whatever it is, this ridge or fracture or line cuts across this line. So you know that this is the most recent relative to this. And that's simply how he did it. So he reverses this picture because there's these huge rifts that appear. They look like rivers. But he said, what if that's not a river? That's the expanding moon of Europa. And they simply reversed it and they matched perfectly.
Yeah.
There's like no other explanation other than this area is spreading.
Yeah.
And some of these rifts go almost around the entire moon. The only way you can get a crack like that is if the object is getting larger.
Yep.
Unless you have subduction zones, there are no quote unquote subduction zones on Europa that they could find.
Right, right. The channel See the Pattern kind of picks up on this and does some similar work with other moons of Jupiter and finds that some of them too show signs of expansion like this. And then he kind of takes it further and he starts looking at other bodies in our solar system, and some of them show clear signs of expansion and some of them don't.
Right, and that's what you would expect. Not everything's, when we look out in our solar system, we have lots of different types of celestial bodies.
Yeah.
And clearly, there is a group of them that are acting in similar fashions.
Right. And surely this has something to do with the chemistry of those bodies as well, and maybe their age and whatever other tidal forces are acting on them based on what planets they're associated with, et cetera, et cetera.
So tidal forces could cause expansion.
Yeah. That could be part of it.
Yeah, maybe something flew by millions of years ago, kicking off this expansion, changing the gravity, or whatever that is that we don't fully understand, to start this mechanism.
Yep.
Now, I would implore everyone to go check out nealadams.com and look at all of his old work. All the videos are still very relevant to any study in the field of expanding Earth. Now, let's close up on a little bit more of the esoteric and maybe some other ideas on what could be happening. If we go with the plasma, see down here, the last bullet, the electric universe theory mechanism, which is not by the main leaders, but by interested EU followers. And so if you click on that, you can come over here to the growing Earth theory and the electric universe theory. Did you read this?
I did not, actually.
It doesn't say much.
Well, I imagine it's just talking about basically bringing in sort of plasma at the poles and that sort of creating new matter inside Earth. Am I correct? I can't really read it from here.
That would be that's our idea.
I mean, yeah, that's what
transmutation at the core.
Right. Right.
But here, this is the bullet list. This is some electric universe consequences of expanding Earth. Changes in gravity without change in Earth's mass. Not knowing what gravity actually is, they must know what they call gravity does. Is that even English?
Yeah. Well, I know what they're saying, right? It's like, okay, we may not understand what gravity is, but we have observed it in a way that we can create calculations that help us calculate gravity, even if we don't understand exactly what it is.
Yeah.
and we can rely on that to some degree.
And just a note, we don't know about trajectory and orbits either. They had to recalculate the position of the craft going to the moon. They had to recalculate its trajectory every few hours, or they would have missed the moon by tens of thousands of miles.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, right? Our calculations are really just estimates.
Yeah.
We're clearly missing something, right? Like any good explanatory theory or calculation is explanatory and predictive, right? And so we have things that are mildly predictive. They get us within the ballpark, but they're not really super precise. Because clearly something's wrong with our theories. That's why it's not that precise.
Yeah. So someone asked at my new website, 5.me/diamond, where you can ask me anything. They said after they watched our show last week, well, what about the whales?
Oh, somebody left a similar comment on YouTube, I think.
Now, if you actually had a legitimate question like that, you could go and use a search engine to say, how long have whales been on Earth?
Exactly.
And they didn't even do that.
Right. Right.
Which is why I set up the website, because most people don't even know how to ask the computer a question.
Yeah, it's really amazing. When I was a child, I don't know why, but I had a serious phobia of the library. I have no idea why that was the case. So when the internet came to be in the mid-90s, I was like happy as a clam because I didn't have to go anywhere to seek information anymore. What an incredible resource. And it blows my mind that people don't realize that that's right at their fingertips.
Wow.
Not to say that all the information on the internet is correct, because by no means is that the case, but
I was an abused child, and I loved going to the library. I loved it, the way it smelled. My mom would drop me off there, and I could stay there I'm going to go there for 4 hours. I'm like 12 and allowed to go to this building. I could go through all of the aisles and look at all the science books. I mean, just the way the book smelled.
Yeah. Yeah.
I loved the library.
I love books.
And we do have a library in Pagosa, so brings back memories.
Yeah.
So I implore you all to learn how to do your research critically, because like we started the show, there are lots of very cursory looks you can do at some ideas and disprove them quite easily.
Yeah. Yeah. But it's also like worthwhile doing, especially when you consider these theories, right? Like a lot of people have asked about in regards to expanding Earth, like, okay, well, how does mountain building happen in that model? And there is a mechanism that could be explained by expanding Earth. So take a sphere where it has expanded. So literally the curvature has widened, and you now have a continent that has to flatten. It has to flatten to meet that new curvature. And so you have excess material that has to go somewhere. So potentially it folds. But even that concept doesn't throw out the idea of like continental impact causing uplift or volcanic uplift. And it's like you have to consider all of those different things. Like there may be 3 different ways of making mountains. It's not all explained by one mechanism.
And we have evidence that there's 3 different there are 3 different types of mountains being built. The one we can't explain is the Rocky Mountains. They go all the way up from British Columbia all the way down to Mexico, and they're in the middle of a plate. Well, it's a continuous line because that's where it kinked when the plate cracked.
Right. And when the plate had to like literally like flatten and compress, you have this extra material. It's got to go somewhere, so it's going to go up. And that was probably just a plane
of weakness, and it's going to fold and uplift on that spot. And that's what we get. It almost looks when we go into town that these mountains just came straight up one day.
Yeah.
And they're weathering that way. They're very young.
Right. Right. And we're literally like living, you and I are living like in the foothills of that, right? Like just at the edge, on the edge of that zone, where things started to fold. It just didn't get quite that high here because it got high at the geez, way to talk, Lee. You know what I'm saying?
The show's almost over. Yeah. So what also happens when these catastrophic kinks occur, like the Rocky Mountains, you get exposed to all the way down to the mantle, and you get massive eruptions. We've got huge calderas around here that are super volcanic. The La Garita caldera is as big or bigger than Yellowstone. That blew up supposedly 30 million years ago. There are a bunch of other large calderas along the Rockies that are all super volcanic calderas, including Yellowstone. which
Right.
all came to be because this giant continental plate kinked and brought material from 50 miles down up into the sky.
Yeah, yeah. And it's interesting, like when you look at Yellowstone, it's like that's like still a remnant of trying to release that pressure. This is a long process. It just doesn't happen overnight.
We have the deepest hot spring in the world in Pagosa Springs.
And no one knows how deep it is because they haven't been able to go deep enough to measure it, which is hilarious.
Yeah, I think the longest cable is 2,500 feet, the last one they brought here, and that they just went to the end and said, oh, it's deeper. They reeled it back in. Oh, and that's the end of the show. It always goes so quick.
I know.
Remember to support Revolution Radio at revolution.radio on the internet. Become a Patreon and check out the podcast tonight on Magnetic Reversal News on YouTube. And we love you. Be safe.
Take care.
You're listening to Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com. And we'll be right back after this message.